Rome is famous for conquering and administering a vast empire, which stretched from northern Britain to the Black Sea, from the Straits of Gibraltar to Egypt in the Middle East. By 117 CE, the Emperor Trajan had pushed Rome's territorial empire to its furthest limits, and this is why you'll often see a map of the empire in 117, because that's the biggest it ever got. Now, some of the new provinces, such as Armenia in Eastern Europe, were short-lived. But another recent conquest, Dacia, across the river Danube, was so thoroughly Romanized that its current inhabitants speak a language derived from Latin, that is Romanian, pretty much in a sea of Slavic languages. Back in 107 CE, Dacians were paraded in Trajan's triumph to celebrate his conquest. And Trajan's monuments put them on eternal display in his grand and opulent imperial forum, paid for with spoils taken from Dacia, which was extremely rich in gold. Instead of columns, some of the colonnades on this forum were held up with marble statues of Dacians in chains, the enslaved literally holding up the empire. They are marked out as other or foreigners by their clothing. They wear trousers, tunics, and often conical hats, and they sport longish hair, complete with shaggy moustache and beard. Now, in case you're thinking, I know I've seen Romans, especially Roman emperors, who have beards. Well, the next emperor after Trajan, Hadrian, made facial hair a bit more fashionable for Roman men. But in doing so, he deliberately recalled the intellectual look of Greek philosophers. So the kind of hair you had meaning. And this is lots of hair, but heavily stylized beards, styled in a particular way, as opposed to the unkempt look that we tend to see on Roman representations of others, especially Northern Europeans. It's this hair and clothing combination which marks out Northerners as distinct from the Greco-Roman world. Now, the centrepiece of Trajan's forum was, and still is, the 130-metre tall column, which is wrapped around with relief sculpture in a sort of spiral cartoon form, telling the story of the two Dacian wars. Again, Dacian warriors, and here they're marked out in the blue circle, are wearing trousers, and they're marked out also by having more hair. And they're often trampled under the feet of Romans and their horses, as you see at the bottom of the blue section here. In this scene, there's a rather gruesome part as well, where we see some Dacians even having been beheaded and their heads held up. This is very much a victor's monument. They're being held up, by the way, to the Emperor Trajan, who's there in a purple circle. He's always taller. He appears many times on this cartoon strip type column. And he is always shown in as a Roman, and as a Roman general in a general's cloak, wearing, it's not very easy to see, but a breastplate and a short military kind of segmented kilt. Roman soldiers are shown constructing walls and forts as well at the bottom of this scene. But even when they're doing this, they're always sporting short hair and armour. We never see the Dacians in helmets, even though helmets are shown elsewhere on this column as part of what's been taken as booty from the enemy. So they're not depicted as military figures. They're rather in disarray. Their armour is just something for the Romans to take from them. And by the way, just as a bit of a sidebar, if you want to see what this column might have looked like, or its relief sculpture might have looked like, then the National Geographic magazine has a fantastic reconstruction which shows the potential here of colorizing. Obviously, there's a certain amount of educated guesswork in the colorization. And they show us how this colorization might have had the potential to highlight the Dacians' difference and point it out to contemporary Rome, because if you mark out in colour that clothing, that facial hair, then it's even more obvious to the viewer that these are different kinds of people. I really like this colorization because it also highlights right at the edge, right in the top right here, that Jupiter is depicted on the side of the Romans. Actually, this is part of the known history of this war, where there was a storm, so-called rain miracle, which turned the tide of battle in the Romans' favour. So it's as if even the gods are on the Romans' side here. Now, right at the top of this column, I have a slide that's very poor quality, but it's the best I have, and partly it's that the top of the column is much more weathered. I just wanted to show you that even though the Dacians are regularly depicted as defeated and humiliated, in this very last top section, and you can see it's trailing off because it is that spiral, so at the end it becomes narrower and narrower. And it's a rather sad scene of Dacians and their cattle and their flocks being driven off their land. They're forced into exile. The Roman colonists move in behind them. And I do wonder, is there perhaps some sympathy being shown here? It's right at the top of the column though, and therefore rather hard to see if you are lower down. Trajan's pictorial treatment of the Dacians builds on those of non-Romans from the earliest imperial period. They're often on coins in a position of submission, as on this Augustan coin. Now here on this denarius and on a depiction of Augustus known as the Prima statue, we see a Parthian, and therefrom Parthia is approximately modern northeastern Iran. Now again, the man here is in trousers. He's not wearing a toga or a military skirt or kilt and a cloak. He's marked out therefore as foreign. The Prima statue is not exactly a triumphal image, and this is because Augustus hadn't conquered Parthia, but it is nevertheless a celebratory image because it's showing the viewer that Parthia had returned Roman standards. That's what this Parthian is doing in this image. These standards had been taken over 3 decades before, when the general Crassus had lost them after an ignominious defeat, and then he was killed on campaign there. The shame of losing these standards was really enormous, and the return, which was achieved by diplomacy, was nevertheless important for Augustus to define as a military victory, if somewhat woolly, over a barbarian people. The coin certainly achieves that by showing the Parthian as different and dominated. Now, the Dacians and Parthians we've seen here would be described by Romans as barbarians. We get that word indeed from the Latin word barbarus. This in turn derives from a Greek term which originally meant a non-Greek, someone who couldn't speak Greek. It was not particularly pejorative in origin, but by the time we get to its usage in imperial Rome, and actually even in later Greek periods, it is closer to our word barbarian, a rough or uncivilized person. It's still specifically a foreigner though, it's now a non-Roman. And while a barbarous might be from any part of the world, for a Roman they're unlikely to be from Italy or the Hellenized world, and they tend to occupy the regions not yet conquered by Rome, particularly to the north. Our fullest description of these northern peoples by Roman writers, I'm turning now to written texts, they come from 2 specific works. One from just before the imperial period in Julius Caesar's own account of his conquest of Gaul. I've got several versions of the translation of this, partly to show you that it comes by many titles. So the Penguin has The Conquest of Gaul, the Oxford World Classics, The Gallic War, and a newer translation from Princeton, The War for Gaul. So you may see it under many titles, they're all the same work. 7 books by Caesar, and then an 8th book telling us of the conquest from 58 going all the way up to 50 BCE. The other text is from the late 1st century CE, so 150 years later, and it's an entirely ethnographic text that is Tacitus Is Germania. This is the main text version I have here, and it does on its cover show some Germanic peoples similarly clothed to the way I've been discussing from an object called the Gemma Augusta. I've also got a very old, now falling apart penguin, which includes another of Tacitus's works, and you can see here it's not called the Germania, it's called Tacitus on Britain, which is a different text, and on Germany. So again, you might see that by different names. As I mentioned, these writers are 150 years apart. 50s BC versus, we know when the Germania was published, it's 98 CE. However, some consistent preoccupations appear in their accounts, and we do see instances of this elsewhere. These are just the best examples, I think. Now, I'm going to start with Caesar's account of the Britons, partly because I'm always very amused by it, coming from Britain myself. His experience of the Britons was to a certain extent limited. The Roman conquest of Britannia, as it was known, came 100 years after his death, but he did go to Britain twice during his time in Gaul. It's very striking that he describes the Britons as super hairy, so hair comes in again. He also comments on their makeup, I guess you'd describe it as. So in Book 5 of the Gallic Wars, he says, and this is my translation, not one of the ones I've just been holding up, the Britons dress in skins. They dye themselves with woad, which makes their skin blue. And this makes them look more terrifying in battle. They wear their hair long and they shave every part of their body, you see, not all hair, except their head and upper lip. So there's a real contrast here again with the clean-shaven Romans, although shaving the body itself was considered by Roman men a bit dubious, potentially feminizing. So that's a bit of a strange thing for these tough northern barbarians to do. There's a lot in these ethnographies, as you might expect, of strangeness about these people. Also, of course, the fact that they dress in skins means there's no manufacture of textiles for clothing, and this, to the Romans, is a sign of a lack of civilization, that you aren't as developed. You're clearly not in a toga, which is made of wool. We also see some discussion in Caesar of the Britons' eating habits, and he makes a distinction between the inland Britons and those who live on the coast. The ones who live on the coast, especially in what is modern Kent, he says are the most civilized because they're closest to the continent. But he says the inland Britons don't even plant crops. They live on what he describes as milk and flesh. And he's very interested in their family groups. He says they aren't monogamous, and they basically have all these wives in common, as he puts it. And they have no way of recognizing the legitimacy of their children. This is really important for the Romans and for Caesar here. It's really anathema to the Romans, where it was essential that the father recognized a child as his own, that he acknowledged the legitimacy of that child. So what we can see here, just from a few examples in both the written texts and the images I've shown you, is that depicting barbarians is a good way to distance them from Romans, and in turn for Romans to define themselves. There's a real reminder here of what is core to their own identity. What is core to Roman identity? Well, there's that parental acknowledgement I've just talked about. There's a particular look that gives you that identity, a particular form of clothing and styling your hair and not painting your body blue. There are other examples of this. For example, the Germani drink beer, not wine. In lots of Roman texts point this out. And they don't even necessarily say not wine. They don't have to. As soon as they say, and they, actually, to be fair, they don't use the word beer or an equivalent. They just say they have this strange drink that they make from grain. The Romans don't really understand it. It's very weird to them. The Gauls practice human sacrifice, so in other words, not just animal sacrifice, which the Romans regard as something that you only do under extremis, in really extreme circumstances, and they haven't done for a very long time, so it's kind of primitive and something from history. And they do it, famously, this is where it comes from, and it's from Caesar's Gallic War, they do it by burning the victims in a giant wicker man. And by the way, Caesar's work is pretty much our sole source for this and everything else we know about Gallic religion and the Druids. So not a lot to go on, and there's been a lot built on that. Barbarians, though, aren't always depicted solely as rough and uncivilized. There are other aspects to them. So when I turn to Tacitus and Tacitus Is Germania, he uses his depiction of the Germani, the Germanic peoples, and especially their family life and the status and behaviour of women to critique what he sees as Rome's moral failings. So he has quotes like, almost alone among barbarians, so he's kind of singling out the Germani here, almost alone among barbarians, they are content with one wife. So he's writing this very approvingly. You can see the contrast with what Caesar had written about the Britons there, that they don't practice monogamy, but the Germani do. So they're kind of like the Romans in that way, in that certainly official marriage is just with one person at a time. And he adds a real kicker here: no one in Germania laughs at vice. They don't think it's fashionable to corrupt or to be corrupted. Now, you might think it's clear from that line that he's maybe pointing back at Rome, and if it wasn't clear from that, he finishes off with a great line. Good habits here, and he means in Germania, here has become Germania for him, are more effective than good laws elsewhere. It's very clear that the elsewhere is Rome itself, and it's an extraordinary way to phrase it. To the Roman reader, they would very clearly, they would read themselves into that text, partly because Augustus, way back 100 years before, had tried to legislate for marriage and against adultery, and these laws had been re-legislated several times by the time Tacitus writes. And apparently the fact that it had to be re-legislated means there was little success. Very hard to police people's behaviour within marriage. And Augustus had no more success than most would. But Tacitus is making a moral point here, and he's kind of building the Germani up as better than the Romans in this particular line. Most of all, though, the picture of northern barbarians in general is one of dedication to war. They're extremely bellicose, they're extremely warlike. This is particularly true of the Germani in both Caesar and Tacitus, and it made Tacitus's text particularly appealing to the Nazi regime in Germany, although I have to say they had to ignore some of Tacitus's statements about their primitive, i.e. the Germans' primitive living conditions and very unappealing landscape. He says it's very swampy and smelly. Now, even though this made the Germani in antiquity a force to be reckoned with and feared, it was not necessarily a positive from a Roman point of view. The Germani, we're back to clothing, the Germani wear their battle dress at all times, even at their political and religious gatherings. So they have no way of delineating civic life, ordinary everyday life, from that of war. They don't have an equivalent of the toga for civilian life. So the Romans actually talk about men going from war dress into the toga. And it is symbolic, but it's not just symbolic. They literally, Trajan wouldn't have been wearing his little military kilt and general's cloak when he appeared before the Senate or in some kind of civic context. Tacitus also talks a lot about the women of the Germani, and he tells us that the women appear on the battlefield, not to fight, but to urge on the men. Now, this would also have seemed incongruous to the Roman reader, where women don't usually attend men on the battlefield. Nevertheless, because they were known as a tough enemy, a victory over any Germanic peoples was extremely desirable to the emperor. In 83 CE, the last Flavian emperor, Domitian, celebrated a triumph over a Germanic group called the Chatti. For the emperor, parading defeated Germani through the streets of Rome while he himself was acclaimed by an adoring crowd, which is what a triumph basically is, this would have been a high point of his career, a demonstration of his leadership and his military prowess. However, in Domitian's case, this desire for accolades was weaponized against him by Tacitus, who hated Domitian and painted him as a paranoid tyrant. The defeated enemies marched in triumph weren't Germani at all, says Tacitus, but slaves bought by the emperor and dressed up to look like these tough northerners. Such were the stereotypes associated with their appearance that Domitian may not have needed the real thing. By this time, it was possible to fool the Roman public, although not Tacitus apparently, with fake barbarians. You just add a beard and dress them in skins, and away you go.